For 40 years, the people of Israel wandered through a desert. But here's the strange part. The journey should have taken only a few weeks. The mountains weren't moving. The land wasn't hiding. The distance wasn't that great. So why did it take 40 years? The answer wasn't the desert. It was the mind. Israel left Egypt in a single day, but it took 40 years for Egypt to leave their thinking. And that reveals something powerful about human change. Because the same thing happens in our lives. We can walk away from a job, a relationship, a habit, or a way of living. We can leave the situation behind, but the mindset we carried inside that situation doesn't always leave with us. And when the mind stays stuck in the past, the journey forward becomes much longer than it needs to be. To understand why, we need to go back to the moment when everything changed. The moment when a people who had lived as slaves for generations finally stepped into freedom and discovered that freedom is harder to live than it is to obtain. Their 40-year trek should have taken weeks. The delay wasn't the terrain, it was their mindset. We often spend years stuck in places we could have walked out of in months. We leave the person or the job, but we carry the old fears with us. That is how a short journey becomes a long exile. Real freedom isn't just walking away, it's outgrowing the version of yourself that stayed. The hardest part of moving forward isn't the road ahead. It's silencing the voice behind you whispering, "Go back." For generations, Israel endured slavery in Egypt, a cycle of survival where the future was something to be endured, not shaped. Many people today feel that same weight. There may not be chains on your hands, but there are chains on your time and expectations. You work, you run, but you never move forward. When life becomes nothing but survival, you stop dreaming. The turning point? They finally cried out for more. History shows that the moment you believe your life can change, the story has already begun to shift. For generations, life was a repetitive loop of survival. Wake up, work, endure, repeat. When the future is just a copy of yesterday, hope feels like a fairy tale, and freedom becomes a distant myth. Many of us live that same rhythm today, carrying pressure and handling responsibilities until getting through the day becomes the only goal. We stop asking for more because we assume this is all there is. But a long-standing pattern doesn't own your future. The greatest shift begins the moment you dare to imagine a different tomorrow. Eventually, the weight of survival for Israel becomes unbearable. Pain reaches a breaking point where silence is no longer an option, and just getting by is no longer enough. We adapt at first. We make excuses and carry the load, but eventually, the human spirit revolts. This cannot be the rest of my story. Change rarely begins with a perfect plan. It begins with that cry. It's the moment you stop quietly accepting what was never meant to hold you. When you finally say, "I was not made for this," hope wakes up and the future cracks wide open. Then, the story shifted. After years of identical days and a locked-in future, the page finally turned. Transformation doesn't wait for certainty or comfort. It begins with movement. It's one step, one decision, one moment where you choose forward, over, here. When you start moving toward a new future, the past loses its power. It is no longer the author of your life. After generations of being told, "This is your place," they finally walked away. No more chains, no more masters, and no more limits on who they were allowed to be. Freedom does something powerful. It reminds you that your life was never meant to be owned by fear or someone else's expectations. In our own lives, that moment may not look dramatic to others, but walking away from the job that drains you or the past that defines you is a massive internal shift. The moment you leave what kept you small, you finally begin to discover who you were always meant to be. The sea stood between their past and their future. Behind them was the safety of the known, even if it meant chains. In front of them was the impossible, a pathless ocean with no guarantees. This is where most people stop. We wait for perfect certainty, wanting every answer before we take the first step. But the path rarely appears until you are willing to move. The sea didn't open so they could admire the view. It opened so they could cross. Step by step, the barrier became a road. The lesson remains. The way forward reveals itself only while you are walking it. Egypt disappeared, and the impossible became real. For generations, freedom was a dream. Now, it was their reality. The chains and the life that defined them were finally fading into the distance. Once you experience the impossible becoming possible, your mind opens. You realize that limits aren't as fixed as they seem. Many people today stay on the edge of their own Egypt, convinced the life they want is out of reach. But when you finally cross your own sea and take that step you thought you never could, the celebration isn't just about the win. It's the realization that the impossible was never as solid as it looked. Freedom didn't lead them to a palace, it led them into the wilderness. Leaving the old life doesn't always mean stepping immediately into a perfect one. Often, there is a middle season where the old structure is gone, but the new life hasn't fully formed. You are no longer who you were, but you aren't yet who you're becoming. That space, without a map or a timeline, is uncomfortable. But the wilderness has a purpose. It strips away what you no longer need and builds a strength that comfort never could. If you are in a wilderness season right now, remember, it isn't the end of your story. It's the preparation for the life you once prayed for. The chains were gone, but the mindset remained. This is why the journey took 40 years. They had left Egypt, but Egypt hadn't left them. Decades of being told no and living in survival mode don't vanish overnight. Many people today make the same mistake. They change their location, but not their thinking. They exit the situation but keep the doubt, entering new opportunities while still expecting to fail. When your inner world stays the same, a short journey stretches into a lifelong trek. The real distance to your future isn't measured in miles. It's measured by how long it takes you to actually believe you are free. The wilderness soon began to test them with hunger, thirst, and uncertainty. Freedom had brought them out, but the desert revealed their true grit. When comfort vanishes, the mind spirals. Was leaving worth it? Would it have been easier to stay? These are the same questions we ask today. When bills mount and progress feels slow, every meaningful change comes with a season of testing, not to destroy you, but to strengthen you. The road to a better life requires more than just freedom. It requires the endurance to stay the course. The mind plays a dangerous trick during hard times. It starts to romanticize the past. As the wilderness grew difficult, the people began to remember Egypt as stable and predictable. They forgot the chains and only remembered the comfort of knowing what to expect. This is the trap of the familiar. We do this today. When a new path gets rocky, the old job or the old toxic habits suddenly seem safer. But familiar is not the same as good. Egypt was survival, not freedom. Progress requires the courage to keep moving even when your memory tries to convince you that the prison you left was actually a home. Pressure doesn't create what is inside you, it reveals it. The wilderness stripped away their distractions, leaving only raw reality, doubt, fear, and impatience. In comfort, confidence is easy. In uncertainty, your true character surfaces. Every hard season presents a choice. Let fear dictate your future, or use the challenge to grow stronger. Standing at the edge of their future, 12 spies explored the land. They found a place of rich opportunity, but they also found massive challenges and strong opposition. The land didn't change that day, but the people's perspectives did. Some saw the potential, others only saw the obstacles. This is the pivot point of every journey. The greatest opportunities are often wrapped in challenges that make them look impossible at first glance. The spies returned with a split report. The land was rich and full of life, but the cities were fortified and the people were strong. The promise was real, but it wouldn't be easy. This is where most people hesitate. Opportunity rarely arrives without a challenge, and every open door requires courage to walk through. The report was the same for everyone, but it triggered two different mindsets. Some focused on the possibility, while others obsessed over the difficulty. At the edge of their future, the battle wasn't about the land anymore. It was about belief. They held physical proof in their hands, fruit from the land itself. The promise was no longer a campfire story. It was tangible, visible, and real. The future they had prayed for was standing right in front of them. But here is the glitch in human nature. Even with proof, belief is still a choice. Two people can look at the same evidence and reach opposite conclusions. One sees a miracle, the other sees a threat. In that moment, the direction of an entire generation was decided not by the facts, but by which voice they chose to believe. Stories like this remind us that the struggles people faced thousands of years ago often mirror our own journeys today. If you enjoy thoughtful stories about history, mindset, and the deeper patterns behind them, consider subscribing. The report turned sour. 10 spies fixated on the obstacles, the walls, the giants, and the risks. Their words shifted the atmosphere from opportunity to dread. When fear speaks loud enough, it drowns out potential. The land hadn't changed, but the conversation had. How do we move forward? Became, what if we fail? This happens in every generation. We stand on the edge of a new idea or a better future. but the voices of doubt shrink the world. The most powerful force isn't the facts themselves, it's the story we tell about those facts. Fear spread like a wildfire, turning a camp of overcomers into a crowd of doubters. That is the nature of fear. It moves fast, jumping from person to person until concern becomes a storm of what if. Suddenly, the people who walked through the sea forgot their own miracles. They stood paralyzed, not because the opportunity had vanished, but because they began repeating the same fearful story to one another. In our own lives, the greatest danger isn't the obstacle in front of us. It's the negative voice that convinces us the challenge is too big to face. Two men, Joshua and Caleb, saw the same walls and the same giants as everyone else, but they reached a different conclusion. They weren't blind to reality, they just refused to let it be the only thing they saw. This is the essence of leadership. Most voices will naturally catalog the risks and list the reasons why something is impossible. But progress depends on the rare few who acknowledge the challenge while championing the possibility. Joshua and Caleb didn't ignore the obstacles. They simply refused to let those obstacles have the final vote on their future. Joshua and Caleb tried to calm the crowd, reminding them of the promise. But fear was louder, and the people refused to listen. This is a hard truth. Sometimes the right message is spoken, but people aren't ready to hear it. Once fear takes hold, logic feels like an enemy, and courage feels like a risk. In this atmosphere, the safe choice starts to look like retreat. But even when a crowd rejects it, the voice of vision matters. It might not change the present moment, but it plants the seeds for the future that will eventually rise. The camp spiraled into panic. The land hadn't changed, but their perspective had flipped. What looked like an open door now felt like a trap. Fear has the power to redefine reality overnight. When panic takes over, we stop planning for the future and start looking for the exit. Every bold step suddenly feels reckless, as the mind invents 1,000 ways to fail. The truth is that the greatest breakthroughs usually arrive disguised as discomfort and uncertainty. The difference between moving forward and turning back comes down to one question. Will fear decide what you see, or will courage? The unthinkable happened. They wanted to go back to Egypt. They were ready to trade their new freedom for their old chains, because fear makes the past look safer than the future. In the face of uncertainty, the mind craves the familiar, even if that familiarity was painful. At least Egypt was predictable, they reasoned. We do this today when a new chapter gets tough. We are tempted to return to the jobs, habits, or mindsets we already understand. But the past is not where your future lives. Sometimes, the greatest act of courage isn't the giant leap forward. It's simply refusing to go back to what once kept you small. Fear evolved from a feeling into a force of rebellion. When fear goes unchecked, it doesn't just resist change. It actively rejects anyone who speaks of hope. Joshua and Caleb offered vision, but to a panicked crowd, courage sounded like a threat. When people are overwhelmed, they don't always want encouragement. They want the pressure to stop. They want someone to tell them that giving up is the safe choice. This is the lonely reality of leadership. The voices that challenge fear are often the first to be pushed aside. But history proves that the message people resist during a crisis is often the very one that defines the future. The journey's direction changed, not because of an army, a wall, or a giant, but because of belief. The greatest obstacle wasn't standing in front of them, it was growing inside them. Their future stalled not because the land was impossible, but because they stopped believing it was possible. This truth echoes today. Most dreams don't fail because the opportunity is wrong, but because belief collapses before the work begins. Businesses aren't started and lives aren't changed, not because the door is locked, but because fear convinces us not to walk through it. The most powerful battles aren't fought on the outside. They happen in the quiet space of what you decide to believe about your future. The people were spared, but their decision had consequences. The timeline of their future shifted. The promise remained real, and the land was still there, but they wouldn't step into it as they could have. This is a sobering truth. Our choices shape the length of the road ahead. Not every mistake destroys a life. Often we get another chance, but the path becomes longer. Opportunities are delayed, and lessons must be learned the slow way. Whether it's a person ignoring a chance to grow, or a leader hesitating in a crisis, life doesn't always end, but it can stretch far longer than necessary. The silver lining? These consequences often become the very lessons that prepare you for the future you once hesitated to claim. They were denied the land they feared, and the wilderness became their home. The opportunity didn't vanish, but the moment to seize it had passed for that generation. What could have been a quick transition became decades of waiting. Life works like that. When we shrink from a chance, the road gets longer. Courage that wasn't chosen in a moment must then be built piece by piece over years. Yet even this delay had a purpose. The wilderness became a training ground where strength was forged and vision was reshaped. It wasn't the end of their story. It was the quiet preparation for a chapter they weren't yet ready to write. Time passed, and the generation shaped by slavery slowly faded. It sounds harsh, but it reveals a deep truth about change. It is easier to move a person's body than it is to move their mind. Even after leaving Egypt, their internal patterns, years of control, fear, and dependence, remained. The hardest thing to change isn't your location, it's how you see yourself. The wilderness became a turning point where the voices of the past grew quiet. As the old fears lost their power, a new generation rose, one that had only known open skies, not chains. They looked at the same future with fresh eyes, proving that real transformation often requires the birth of entirely new thinking. The wilderness was a place of quiet, invisible change. To an outsider, it looked like nothing was happening, just another sunrise over the same sand, another day of waiting. But the transformation was internal. The desert was teaching patience to a people who once only knew survival, and building a strength that comfort never could. We often mistake these quiet seasons for simple delays, but the wilderness isn't empty time. It is the slow, essential work of shaping you. What feels like waiting is actually the preparation required to finally step into the future you once feared. The road stretched on, day after day, across the sand. This wasn't the era of breakthroughs or celebrations. It was the long, quiet stretch in between. For most of us, this is where life is actually lived, in the seasons where progress feels slow and every day looks identical. It is the steady effort of continuing the journey, even when the destination feels a lifetime away. But those years were not wasted. Every step was distancing them from their past and forging a new identity. Sometimes, growth isn't a loud explosion. It's simply the quiet courage to keep walking when the journey is longer than you expected. When you finally arrive, you'll realize that the long road was the only thing that made the destination possible. The children of the wilderness were born beneath open skies, far from the echoes of Egyptian chains. They didn't grow up under masters or wake to the sound of commands. Their first memories were of wide horizons and stories of freedom. Environment shapes vision. While their parents were defined by the walls that once held them, this new generation was defined by the space around them. They learned that tomorrow didn't have to be a copy of yesterday. Every era sees this shift. A new generation rises, unbound by old fears, looking at the same challenges their parents feared and seeing only possibility. Real history often changes most profoundly in this quiet way, when children grow up inside a different story than the one that came before them. The wilderness raised a generation that knew the stories of slavery but didn't carry the scars. While their parents were masters of survival, these children were students of possibility. There is a profound power in hearing about chains without ever having felt them. It allowed this new generation to look at the same world and see a different future. Their horizon wasn't limited by the walls of the past. It was defined by the open sky they had walked under their entire lives. In every era, progress depends on these new minds, people who refuse to let the trauma of a previous generation dictate the boundaries of their own. They didn't just change their location, they finally changed the story. A new generation rose, looking at the exact same landscape, the same hills, the same cities, and the same giants, yet seeing a completely different reality. Where their parents saw a death trap, they saw a foundation. This shift didn't happen because the geography changed, but because their internal weight had. They weren't running from a nightmare, they were moving toward a dream. This is a quiet law of life. New vision requires a new perspective. When you aren't bound by the traumas of those who came before you, you stop asking, what if we fail? And start asking, what can we build? Every generation, and every individual, eventually gets this same chance, to look at a challenge and refuse to view it through someone else's limits. The journey finally resumed, moving toward the exact same land that had paralyzed the previous generation. The landscape was identical. The same cities, the same hills, and the same daunting challenges waited just beyond the horizon. But the people had changed. The generation that trembled at giants was gone. In their place stood a people forged by the wilderness, strengthened by 40 years of steady walking and silent growth. To them, the land didn't look like a threat, it looked like a future. This reveals a profound truth. Often, the opportunity doesn't change, and the world doesn't change. What changes is the person looking at it. When you finally swap fear for courage, the journey that once stalled can finally move forward again. The landscape remained unchanged. The same mountains, the same walls, and the same rugged terrain that had paralyzed the previous generation. The difficulty level of the task hadn't dropped, and the work ahead was still a staggering reality. But the perspective had shifted entirely. Mountains don't move just because time passes, and goals don't suddenly become easy because we want them to. What changes is the person standing at the base of the climb. Where the first generation saw an ending, the next generation saw a path. Life rarely clears the road for us. Instead, it waits for us to grow into the version of ourselves capable of handling the trek. The mountains were still there, but finally, there were people strong enough to climb them. The landscape was identical, the same valleys, the same fortified cities, and the same daunting challenges. But the eyes looking at them had changed. These were eyes that had matured in freedom, eyes tempered by the endurance of the wilderness, and eyes that finally believed the future was a prize to be claimed, not a threat to be feared. This internal shift, small but seismic, changed everything. The world rarely does us the favor of changing first. The opportunities, the obstacles, and the mountains usually stay exactly where they are. What transforms the outcome is the mindset of the person standing in front of them. History doesn't turn when the landscape softens. It turns when one generation looks at the impossible and simply says, "Let's begin." The generation born in chains saw giants. The generation born in the wild saw possibility. The geography was identical, the challenges were the same, but the lens through which they viewed them had shifted entirely. The first generation's instinct was survival, caution, fear, and protection. But the next had learned endurance. They knew how to move through difficulty rather than live under it. When they looked at the land, they didn't see a threat to flee, they saw a foundation to build upon. This is the quiet power of perspective. Two people can face the exact same reality and walk toward two completely different futures. One maps out the limits, the other maps out the potential. The greatest turning points in life don't happen because the giants leave. They happen the moment you stop staring at the giants and start noticing the possibilities standing right behind them. The greatest obstacles in life aren't the ones in front of us. They are the ones inside us. It's not the mountain on the horizon or the challenge on the road. It's the quiet, persistent voice that whispers, "You can't." The Israelites didn't stop because the land was unreachable. They stopped because fear convinced them it was. This same battle plays out in every generation. People stand at the edge of new paths and bold ideas every day. But the first barrier they face isn't the external world. It's the narrative inside their own minds. What if I fail? What if I'm not ready? These thoughts feel small, but they act as the architects of our lives. The most formidable walls we ever face aren't built from stone. They are built from doubt. But there is a turning point. The very moment you begin to challenge that doubt, the path forward, once closed, begins to open. The wilderness was never just a delay. It was a transformation. What looked like lost time, decades of wandering in the desert, was actually the slow, deliberate reshaping of a people. It was the process of turning survivors into builders and fear into endurance. What felt like aimless wandering was the necessary preparation to move from a mindset of looking back to a mindset of moving forward. Life often mirrors this pattern. You may find yourself in a season that feels slow, where progress is hidden, and you wonder if any of it matters. But beneath the surface, your thinking is hardening, your patience is deepening, and your vision is clearing. The wilderness doesn't just test you, it changes you. And often, the very season that feels like a frustrating delay is the exact one preparing you to finally step into the future you once thought was impossible. The shift from a slave mindset to a builder mindset changed everything. The landscape remained harsh, the mountains were still high, and the walls were still thick, but the people looking at them were transformed. They stopped seeing themselves as victims of their past and started seeing themselves as architects of their future. This is the most powerful internal shift a person can experience. When you believe you are trapped, every obstacle is proof you should stop. But when you believe you are capable, that same obstacle is simply a problem to be solved. The wilderness had completed its work. A new mindset had taken root. Once you change how you see yourself, the future opens in ways that once felt like a fantasy. The final truth of the journey is this: Israel left Egypt in a single day, but it took 40 years for Egypt to leave their minds. Physical freedom can happen in an instant. A door opens, a contract ends, a person walks away. But internal freedom is a deeper, slower transformation. It takes time to unlearn the reflex of fear and to replace the survival instincts of the trapped with the vision of the free. The wilderness was the forge for this new mindset. But the mental habits of generations still echoed in their thoughts. Those echoes don't vanish overnight. They are silenced only through the steady, daily practice of walking forward. Because the hardest chains to break are never made of iron. They are the invisible constraints of doubt and the stories we tell ourselves about what is impossible. The moment those mental chains finally fall, you aren't just free in your circumstances, you are finally free to own your future. The people of Israel eventually stepped into the land their parents once feared. The mountains were still there, the cities were still fortified. The giants had not disappeared, but the people looking at them had changed. They had spent 40 years walking beneath open skies, learning patience, endurance, and trust. What once looked like wandering had quietly become preparation, and the same pattern appears in our own lives. There are seasons when progress feels slow, when every day looks the same, when we wonder if we made the wrong move. But those quiet seasons are often doing the deepest work. Israel left Egypt in a single day, but it took 40 years for Egypt to leave their minds. Because the hardest chains to break are never made of iron. And sometimes the wilderness you wish would end is the very place that is preparing you for the future you once feared.